Well, a few years ago, we were meeting some friends for a birthday celebration at a restaurant. It was a really hot summer day. And at that time, we had 2 cars. And so my wife and I and our son were traveling to the restaurant. And our daughter was coming to the restaurant from another engagement. Perhaps she was working. I'm not sure what she was actually doing. We got to the restaurant. And our family friends were already there. And one of their kids, young adult, said, "Have you heard the news?" And I, "Well, what news?" He says, "Well, I've got bad news and I've got bad news for you. Which do you want first?" What kind of question is that? He says, "Well, they can't seat us all in the patio." So that was, I guess, a bit of a disappointment to him. And then he said, "And Brianne has been in a car accident." You're kidding. And so, my face goes white and and so thankfully he didn't let this go too long. He says, "She's fine. My dad's gone to pick her up and he's bringing her to the restaurant." And in fact, she was fine. We had to lay our Toyota to rest, but she was all okay. But there are times, you were told you're about to receive bad news. And you're going, "I don't want to hear the bad news. Can I have the good news, bad news option? I'll just pick the good news." But here I've got bad news. Have you heard it? He's about to deliver it. We're going to start a new series now. And the whole series is bad news because it's a prophet. So we're going to look at the prophet of Amos. And he was commissioned to be a messenger, a conduit, an ambassador of bad news. Thankfully, you and I have been given a mandate to be deliverers and messengers and conduits of good news. But we all know that even that good news, there's some bad news in it, right? Because we learn dangerous things about God, important things about God. And as we work our way through the book of Amos, we're going to learn some things about God that are going to unsettle us, that are going to unnerve us. And yet we want to invite that as we seek to wrestle with the message that Amos had at a very particular time in Israel's history. Now, before we even look at the biblical text, I want to make a brief comment about hermeneutics, about interpretation, about how we look at the scriptures. Certain passages are just so clear. Some of the teachings of Jesus are just so clear. There are some difficult ones, certainly some challenging ones, but generally speaking, so much of what Jesus says is clear, whether we like it or not, whether we respond to it or not. It's a choice we've got to make. Sometimes he speaks in hyperbole, sometimes he speaks in parable, sometimes he speaks in metaphor, and oftentimes he speaks with great clarity. But when we look at other passages, when we look at narrative, we look at historical settings, we look at particular Old Testament passages, we look at prophecy or poetry, and sometimes we need to be careful with how we approach it. So I want to share with you, if you're an upperclassman, you see me do this 2 years ago, you see me do it last year, I'm going to keep doing it because this helps me so much, and I think it'll help you. This is how I approach the scriptures. And every time I look at the scriptures, every time I have my quiet time or when I'm studying for a message, I ask myself 3 fundamental questions. What does the text say? What does the text mean? And what does this text mean to me? Observation, interpretation, application. What does it say? What does it mean? What does it mean to me? So here is the text that we're looking at. And as we look at that biblical text, this is what all your biblical courses are about. You're exegeting the text. You're looking at the context. You're doing etymological studies of words. You're looking at who's speaking, who are they speaking to. You're looking at all kinds of implications and surrounding who, what, when, where, and understanding exactly what was going on in this historical episode at this moment in time. And of course, we live today. And somehow we believe that occasion, that episode, that experience, that historical record for us somehow can make a difference in our lives today. How do we get from here to there? And the way we get from here to there is by building a bridge with a transferable principle. What is true? So, text, today, transferable principle. Observation, what does the passage say? Interpretation, what does the passage mean? What was true 3,000 years ago was still true 500 years ago and will be true tomorrow. What does it say? What does it mean? But here's where it does its work of transformation. What does it mean to me? And we spend a great deal of time here in our classes understanding what does the text say, a desperately important thing that we learn. But we also want to understand what does it mean and what does it mean to us? How does this change me? Because if it doesn't change me, we've aborted the very purposes for which God wants to plant the seeds of truth in our lives. Because he wants it to change not just what we know, more information, but change the way we live and change the way we behave. And so the scriptures are there for our benefit to change us. Now the passage that Chaplain Dan read, he read from Romans 15, and if you heard tucked in there in the middle of that paragraph, it says this: for everything was written in the past and was written to teach us. It's there for our good. It's not just, here's an interesting story that you might want to know that happened. It's there to teach us so that through endurance and the encouragement of the scriptures, we might have hope. 1 Corinthians 10 is even more elaborate. In 1 Corinthians 10, he talks about all the great things that Israel received. Then it talks about all these ways that Israel messed up horrendously. And then he says this. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6. He says, now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our heart on evil things as they did. In other words, I'm telling you all these stories about Israel and its past and all the debacles and all the poor decisions. We're telling you these things so you learn from them. So you don't have to make the bad decisions yourself. You can make good decisions. And so we want to learn things. So when we study the scriptures, what do we learn about God and about humanity and about God's values and how he wants to work? So with that just as a primer, let's look at Amos. And we're just really introducing this series this morning. So you look at Amos chapter 1. I'm just going to read the first two verses. The words of Amos, who was among the shepherds of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, a king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. And he said, the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. Well, let's ask ourselves just a few things to understand this passage and how it might be relevant to us today. And again, this is just barely an introduction. But what do we learn about Amos? Well, Amos was from Tekoa, about 20 kilometers from Judah. He was in the south. He lived in the south, and yet he was commissioned by God, as we're going to see, to speak chiefly to the north. He does have somewhat of a message for Judah as well, and he does also have a message for some of the surrounding nations. But his primary calling was to speak to the nation, the tribes to the north. And so he took on that mandate, and he was going to speak in, well, really, in some ways, unfriendly territories. As a shepherd or a shepherd rancher, in other words, he had oversight over a number of shepherds, and he was a breeder as well. And we also know that he was a farmer. He cared for sycamore trees. In fact, in chapter 7, verse 14, it says, then Amos answered and said to Amaziah, the priest at that time, I was no prophet, nor prophet's son, but I was a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock, and the Lord said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel. And so here we have not a clergyman, not a trained prophet or a priest. He was a layman. He was a businessman. He was a shepherd. He was a rancher. He was a farmer. He was an entrepreneur. And probably because of his role, he probably was somewhat stable himself, probably fairly highly regarded in the community. But I think there's all kinds of learnings there about God and how he uses Amos, a shepherd from Tekoa. Some surprises here, because so often God uses a priest or a prophet or a king in very specific ways. But here he throws us a bit of a curveball and uses someone different. Someone a little out of the ordinary. A leader, a person who wants to be an agent of influence, a person who is willing to be used, but not somebody who came out of the professional circuit. And I want you to know his willing heart, because he was used by God to bring a message to the tribes of the north up until the time of the earthquake. And Flavius Josephus talks about it, a Jewish historian, talks about this earthquake that took place and the damage that was realized. And so Amos had a 2-year mission, and he adopts that mission, he accepts that mission, he willingly accepts the charge that God has for him. And so God uses whoever he wants. God's not looking always for potential. I look for potential. You look for potential. And God gives us potential. But what's God ultimately looking for? Obedience. And Amos was obedient. And so he takes on this responsibility, and he goes into unfriendly territory. Unfriendly territory in this sense. He's going to the north. Let's think about it. If someone's going to criticize Canadian culture, we like it to be Canadian. If someone's going to criticize American culture, American's going to be much more responsive if it's an American. If we're going to criticize India, more appropriate come from an Indian. If someone's going to criticize Brazilian culture or German culture, it's more appropriate that it come from someone who understands and lives in that culture. But here, he was going to leave the south, he was going to go to the north, and he was going to find himself in some unresponsive, unfriendly territory and deliver bad news, a hard message. And he follows the call of God on his life as a business person, as a farmer, as a shepherd. So I think that has all kinds of relevance to you and I today. See, your parents' generation, your grandparents' generation, even more, sometimes would talk about the call to the ministry. And what they meant by that was call to vocational Christian ministry. And that's a thoroughly biblical concept, as is the concept of being called, period. We've looked at Ephesians 2:10, how God has prepared every one of us to do good works with our life, good works that God's prepared in advance for us to do. There's a call of God in every one of us. And so as we equip the church and as we engage the world, we're going to do so as a realization, as an expression of our call in obedience. That's what Amos did. Some of you, I hope many of you, will go into vocational Christian ministry because the church needs help. But I pray that all of you, whether you go into marketplace or healthcare, wherever you end up, that you go into that industry, into that field, into that orbit, into that world with a sense of call to be an agent of influence for the sake of the gospel. That's what Amos was. He was willing to do what God was calling him to do. And so he left his world for a season and was a prophet. What do we learn about the times? Let me be real quick here. He spoke about two kings in these first two verses. King Uzziah, who started well in the south, he was in Judah, started well and then gets infected with some pride and makes some bad decisions. And in the north, Jeroboam the second actually, he was king of Israel, the northern tribes. And he made all kinds of bad decisions. Now, let me just make some real quick comments. In the north, it was a season of prosperity. In the north, from a military perspective, they were very strong. They were well insulated because to the south, Egypt they had the buffer of Judah, keeping them from Egypt. Of course, to their west, they had the Golan Mountains, or the Golan Heights, as we now refer to them. To the north, Syria was occupied with the Assyrians, and to the east. Which way are you looking? I'm getting confused here. To the east, of course, was the Mediterranean. So they were quite insulated. They were quite protected. And this is a time of great prosperity. There's a growing wealthy class. More and more had summer homes and winter homes. They were importing luxurious furniture, lavish international foods. In this time of prosperity, they were starting to exploit the poor. Slavery as debt repayment was very common. And religion was flying high, except it was a religion that was characterized by idolatry and all kinds of merging with other religious expressions. And they had drifted ever so far from what God intended, ever so far from the righteousness of God's expectations, ever so far from what they were, or certainly from what they should have been. Now, when you think of the world that you and I live in, I know we're in an economically slow time. There's a bit of a slump. Gas prices are low and the dollar's low. We get that. But from a global perspective, we live in an incredibly prosperous world. And we have so many of the same characteristics of Israel at this time. We count our square footage. And we have our sushi, and we have our Ethiopian latte, and we have our imported goods, and we go to our live concerts, and then we withdraw into our home and watch Netflix. And we've got all these creature comforts and all these luxuries. And so it's into that kind of a world that God calls Amos to deliver a hard message. So what do we learn about God? Well, we only learn about one thing, really, that's said here in these first two verses, because again, it's just an introduction. But what does he say about God? Well, he says this: the Lord roars from Zion and utters his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the top of Carmel withers. And what image is being created here as we read this is that a lion would roar as he's about to pounce on his prey. And what that roar would do, it would so frighten the prey that it would almost be paralyzed for a brief moment. And here he's sort of giving an image that God's going to scorch the land and a drought would come. And it would hurt the industry of shepherds because, of course, with drought, there's less feed and all the implications, attending implications. Carmel was often associated with gardens and its beauty. He said it's all going to look different because the Lord is about to roar. And as we work through our way through the book of Amos, we're going to see that Amos is all about a picture of God, the sovereign one who has a right to rule the universe, and how he's going to call particular Israel out for its abysmal treatment of its people, of its drift from God. And he's going to call out the nations of the world, but he's going to particularly target Israel and punish them for their departure from God's covenant. And then we're going to see there's this repentant remnant who comes back to God, and God uses them to have an impact in the nations of the world again. But we're going to learn something about God and what he values and what breaks his heart. So as we look into Amos, yes, it was a particular lesson, a particular message for particular people at a particular time in history. Let's acknowledge that very carefully. But let's learn things about God which were true then that they're also true today. And let's invite God to rummage around our hearts and to help us see those cultural entrapments which we're so accustomed to, we're so used to that we don't even see them anymore. Because some things about God that were true then are true about God today. And may we need to bring ourselves into submission under those truths, repent of them, and set our hearts on a course for righteousness. Father in heaven, teach us as we bring ourselves under the authority of your word. Not just that we'd know more, but so that we be conformed to the image of Jesus. Amen.